This is Steve Zeltzer with KPFA WorkWeek Radio, and I'm with Lynda Deschambault, who is a chemist and physical scientist at the Environmental Protection Agency Region 9 in the West Coast. And she has got involved in protecting our health and safety, the public's health and safety, because of the importance of that in the environment. Welcome to WorkWeek Radio.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And why don't you talk about how you decided to work for the EPA and what you wanted to do with your science?
Well, that's a good question. Originally, I had worked 17 years in the laboratory business. I have a chemistry background, and I had been doing soil and fish assays, telling everybody for 17 years what was in their soil, water, fish, and I decided I wanted to get into cleanup or remediation or enforcement work to do something about it.
And the EPA is in charge, along with other agencies, in the cleanup of brownfield sites, highly Superfund toxic sites. Were you involved in that at all?
Yes, well, the agency's mission overall is to protect human health and the environment. One of the ways to do that is the CERCLA or Superfund process, and that was one of the last jobs that I had held in my 20-year career there at the agency, was a project manager of Superfund sites.
And many of these Superfund sites, they have chemicals, they have radiation, they have many toxic materials, and people who live near them are, in fact, getting sick as a result of these sites. Is that what you found?
Yes, that's how they become listed. They're usually large, higher contaminated sites that are problematic for multiple media or multiple jurisdictions, may cross city, county, state lines, and impact the community that is in the area.
Now, there is an issue in the United States as far as fighting for health and safety and protection of the environment, that this is a cost factor, that it'll be cost in jobs and it'll be cost that has to be factored in. What is your view about that whole idea?
Well, I think the cost to the community and the health impacts and the long-term impacts is far more costly than doing the right thing to clean up these sites. The sites usually have a responsible party, who has contributed to the contamination, and it's important that they get cleaned up and taken care of and avoid the longer-term costs.
Now, there was recently in the Bay Area and around the country a March for Science. Why would scientists have to have a March for Science?
Well, I was there. I'm not sure why we should have a March for Science myself. It's
kind of crazy, I think.
Extremely crazy. To me, being an analyst, the science is the science.
And what did you find in that march? I mean, apparently there were a large number of scientists, not just in government, in federal agencies, but all over, who are concerned that there's an attack on science.
Yeah, absolutely. I went to Washington, D.C. this year. I had done the march last year locally in the Bay Area, and this year I actually, considering what's gone on with me personally and with the agency, opted to join the folks in Washington, D.C., and people were united in wanting to have their health protected and wanting to have their concerns heard.
And so let's talk about your history at EPA and why, after 26 years, you decided to leave the agency. What was going on at EPA that caused concern to you and also might be of concern to the public and working people?
Actually, it was 20 years. I was at the EPA for 20 years, and I personally had a number of impacts. The main thing that was impacting me individually is, ironically, EPA's Region 9 office in San Francisco, their own building is contaminated, and it has been contaminated with indoor air concentrations that exceed risk screening levels for formaldehyde and other chemicals, and I was one of the employees that was impacted by that. So it was difficult for me to get into the office. On top of not being able to get into the office as regularly as I'd like, there was a lot of pressure coming down from above, specifically about the Superfund program under Scott Pruitt, and specifically about the site that I was working on. So it's very difficult to participate, and there were a lot of management decisions that were being made, and the decisions were being taken away from the scientists at a time when it was difficult for me to be in the office.
Well, how could workers be expected to work without concern if they were working in a building that was toxic, and what was done about it?
Well, a lot of people had been asking to have it mitigated and cleaned up, but the irony was, as a LEED certified building, my understanding is the building was so tightly secured as an envelope for energy efficiency that they were having difficulty getting in fresh air to flush out the building. And how to deal with it, they were mitigating for people that were having problems with being in the building, like myself. They were allowing us to work at home. That was, and they were doing monthly sampling and monitoring and hoping the half-life of the chemicals over time would break down, and that was going to be the solution.
And who is Scott Pruitt, for those who don't know, and why has he had the big effect in the EPA that he has?
Well, the President of the United States gets to appoint the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, and he has appointed Scott Pruitt. What I know about Scott Pruitt is he has spent his career suing the EPA 13 times, I believe, is the number I've heard. And so now he is been appointed as the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. What we have is the regulated community is now regulating the Environmental Protection Agency.
And by the regulators supposed to be regulating, I mean, he has sued on behalf of who when he was outside the agency?
I am actually not that much of a, I'm not sure who his client was. I believe it was various state and various corporations suing the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm not versed
So
in
these corporations did not want the EPA to have the power to regulate them.
Yeah, they kept arguing that this was a burden on corporations to do their business, and they didn't want to be regulated.
And are you concerned that the appointment of Scott Pruitt and others by President Trump to agencies which are supposed to regulate the health and safety of the public have become captured by the very people they're supposed to regulate?
Well, it does kind of make it difficult to pass the laugh test. I kept an open mind and I was watching to see what would happen. We've had other appointees under other presidential administrations before, but what I've seen so far and firsthand was this is very much a concern.
And what did you see personally?
Well, the site I was managing was impacting the community up in the South Lake Tahoe area. It was an abandoned mine site impacting the local Washoe community. And Scott Pruitt had put together as one of his first tasks the Streamlining Superfund Task Force. And he had been issuing memos to try to figure out how to streamline or expedite or close out that process. That in itself made me wonder what that meant exactly. But my sites that I was working on was specifically in that same time period selected to go through a process that was called Lean. It's a business manufacturing term similar to ISO, formation. I argued that we had a scientific CIRCLA Superfund process in place. What was the point of trying to apply a manufacturing process to a Superfund cleanup process and a risk assessment? And had this ever been done at Superfund sites before? I asked for examples. I was trying to keep an open mind. I was told that no, there was not examples of this being used in the past and that this was going to proceed. I suggested that we use the lean process in other manners, such as, well, if Scott Pruitt and EPA and BP Oil really want to expedite the process, let's use that to get our data faster. The Washoe tribe would like to see their data on the fish that they've been eating. They'd like to see the data on the plants that they've been using in their processes. But the administration, the managers said, no, at your Superfund site, we're going to use this process for the RFS or the risk assessment. And I found that very uncomfortable since we have a very well-known process in place.
And so this particular project you're working on was affecting Native American people in that area.
Yes, that's specifically why the site is listed. Before a site gets on a Superfund site list, you have to look at the impacts to the environment and the area and impacts to human health and impacts to ecological health. This site in particular had been listed. The council chairman at the time of the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California had specifically gone to EPA and had asked for assistance, and that was the reason the site is under investigation. It had caused exposures and contamination to the environment where they live and the Washoe people.
And what kind of chemicals and environmental hazards were there?
Well, this is an acid mine drainage site and it's an old sulfur mine site. So what's happening is the open pit mine is mixing with air and water and turning acidic sulfuric acid and leaching a number of metals into the river and into the watershed.
So it's affecting, it could be thousands of people.
Well, the area is remote, and it really depends how the land is used and what type of institutional controls are put on there. I mean, one of the reasons you site mine sites in remote areas is to try to minimize people to know they're there or to know their impacts. But there are a number of community members. There is recreation, there's hunting and fishing, it's Forest Service land, and definitely the Washoe people have rights to hunt and gather on that land, and they are going to be impacted.
Now, what other things were happening to your fellow workers at the agency that were also of concern to you?
I think this type of similar pressure, and we were feeling a lot of pressure not to put out fact sheets, not to hold meetings, to sort of back off, to not do our jobs.
You told the New York Times you thought it was working like at a morgue.
Yeah, especially towards the end, it was pretty barren group of people, and the people that were there were very cautious, very concerned, not sure what this meant for them or their jobs. People just sort of tiptoeing around. I myself was told to try to compromise more, try to be as invisible as possible. So you're walking around an office sort of unsure what to do, and people aren't talking. It was very quiet and somber.
You think they wanted the scientists to disappear?
I'm not sure if that's what they wanted, but they were getting successful. A lot of people were leaving. A lot of people were rethinking their career paths.
And this issue of these Superfund toxic dump sites, there are many in the Bay Area, Hunters Point, Bayview, Treasure Island, many shipyards that have been highly contaminated, and toxic dump sites. Do you think that the people who live in the Bay Area can be confident that they're actually going to be cleaned up before they're developed at this point because of what's happening at the EPA?
Well, it's hard to say. We have a very clear circular process that we go through. The people that remain, the employees that remain at EPA are committed, dedicated, some of the most dedicated people I've ever worked with. So one would hope that the process will continue to be used. I think at this time it's slowed down, it's stymied, and it's still to be seen what type of pressure or impact that this administration is going to have on that. It's hard to know. I'm hopeful that the scientists that remain, I'm hopeful that...
How many are left at these agencies, at the EPA? I mean, they've lost hundreds, apparently?
Yeah, I don't know the numbers, and it's not just recent loss. That's the thing that's really important for people to understand. This war on EPA has been going on for a while. We saw a lot of cuts under the former Republican Congress as well as what's going on now. So it's to say we just lost 700 people is really a misnomer, because you have to look at what's really been lost over the last 10 years.
So there's been a real serious downsizing of the agency.
Yes, and particularly in Region 9, what was really interesting is our administrator at one point thought he would be proactive and try and do a cut ahead of time, hoping to avoid cuts when they were forced upon us from D.C., and Region 9 San Francisco office in the end ended up getting cut twice. So, it's kind of like PG&E telling you they're going to charge you if you're using too much electricity, but you've already put in all your energy efficiency applications over the 12 years and not getting any credit for it. So here EPA was doing the right thing, and so the Region 9 office has had some severe cuts.
And their union members, AFSCME, I think represents the EPA employees. What was the role of the union in trying to fight back against these cuts and intimidation of employees?
The last cuts happened so fast. I mean, prior to that, they were involved in trying to understand how the offers would be made, or how the people would be selected, and if it would be per division. And the unions were at the meetings, were participating at the table and trying to argue for science and argue for less cuts.
Do you think that the position of the unions and the public, as a matter of fact, should be that there should not be any development on any Superfund site because they're not being properly cleaned up? It appears that businessmen are being put in charge of development, and the charge is that they're supposed to be cleaned up because they're going to be used by the public.
I mean, ultimately, we'd like to see these lands come back around and be developed, but they have to be done with a precautionary principle. You have to go through the science and test, and you have to test for all the chemicals of concern. You can't just test for one chemical and say, oh, that looks good, move on, because maybe there's another chemical that hasn't been looked for. So it's important for EPA to have the science, the money to do the science, and the diligence to do their work. The concern is that, particularly at Superfund sites where they could be redeveloped eventually, is that the important word in Superfund has been gone for quite a while. The fee as you go that corporations paid that was used to clean up these sites, to do their diligence, to make sure they're clean enough and ready for development and reuse, has gone away. So now what's happening are these sites that we're looking at and trying to analyze to say, are they really ready for development? Have all the health concerns been mitigated? Are now being paid for and run by the responsible party themselves, not by funding from EPA, but actually by the corporations themselves.
And we can trust them to do a good job of oversight on themselves.
I don't know about you, but I'm not that confident.
Now, I mean, one of the laws that was passed by Congress, actually supported by developers, was the Brownfield Act, which basically developers promised that if these toxic dump sites were turned over to them, they would clean them up and they would be responsible, and then they could develop them. What has, in your view, been the result of the Brownfield Act?
You know, I didn't work in that department specifically. I have colleagues who did. I did work in the pollution prevention program where they were trying to collaborate and bring in what would be considered waste from industry into a product for development. And I did see some of that where they were bringing in fly ash for concretes, bringing in rubber recycled for false turf for playgrounds, and I saw concerns with that from a scientist. I saw that over time these things leach, and the testing that you did at the time, sure, that concrete is secure and the fly ash isn't leaking. Yes, that grass turf doesn't seem to have any problems, but over time they found that some of these things start to degrade and break down into products that weren't originally known, and so ongoing monitoring is essential to make sure that this doesn't keep happening.
Now, another issue that's come up in the Bay Area and around the country, but especially in the Bay Area, has been the retaliation against whistleblowers at Hunters Point, Tetra Tech. I don't know if you had any knowledge about that, and also Test America, which was a company that Michael Madry, who was an assurance quality manager, noticed that the tests were faulty, and they were moving ahead with it regardless, and he was retaliated against. You don't have any knowledge at EPA about what was happening as far as a proper testing of these Superfund sites?
No, I do know that we have oversight and we take split samples and we do look at that data. And at the sites that I've worked at, we tried to have diligence for QA/QC, and that was part of the problem. The experience that I have, and I had worked in the laboratory for 17 years, I knew that there were questions to be had and things that still needed to be looked at, and the responsible parties were arguing that I was slowing down the process, when in fact it was important as a scientist, as a chemist, that we do the diligence on the data so that type of thing doesn't happen, and that we knew that the QA/QC was sound, and then when you have sound data, then you can go forward with your risk assessment.
And the issue of a future of the EPA as a agency to protect the public, you're kind of smiling. You don't really yourself have any confidence that that is going to happen at this point?
I think I would have stayed there if I had the confidence. I loved my job. I loved the people I worked with. I just really felt that the changes that were in front of me were such that it didn't seem we could do our jobs. The decision making was being taken out of the hands of the scientists. Managers were driving decision making. There's no funding to do what we wanted to do, and we're in for a lengthy legislative process ahead in order to maintain or hold the line on all of these various programs that this administration are trying to cut.
So it sounds like the agency was basically being liquidated or destroyed to really become not the EPA but something else.
Well, I think Trump was clear in his campaign promises that that's what he intended to do, and it seems that he's making some progress. I did hear an interview with Gina McCarthy recently that gave me some hope. She really felt, as a former administrator at EPA, that there's a long legislative process ahead, that you can't just remove these without replacing them with something. But me personally, on the ground, in the trenches, what I was seeing happening at my job and not being able to do the work I was trained to do and had lived my career to aspire to do, or was not something I was able to do from EPA any longer.
And what do you think people should do, the labor movement and people in general in this country who are concerned about protecting their health and safety and having scientists do the work to make sure that our environment is clean and their children can grow up and have a society in which you're not going to get sick and get cancer and other diseases?
Well, I've been asking myself that. I've done a number of interviews recently since I left, and I have at the end said, so what? So what's the next step? What do we do about this? I think the most important thing is outreach and education so that people understand what's going on and for people to do something. Just not even just cast their vote, but to actually be involved. If you have a union, join the union. If you have a local council meeting, go to the meetings. If there's a hearing on a site near you, I think people are so overwhelmed, they don't even know what to do next. They're not even sure how to help. How do we protect our future? Where are we going with this? I see a shift, and I've always felt pretty strongly about bottom up. I've done some nonprofits myself. I was the former mayor of my local community. I think getting involved at that local level is going to be essential. I'm seeing the mayors united across the globe on climate change. I see states across the U.S. suing and getting involved. I think people need to pay attention, get involved, vote, write letters, and don't give up. Keep holding the fight and keep fighting for our own protection. We have a right to clean air and clean water.
I just returned from England, United Kingdom, and while I was there, Jeremy Corbyn and the assistant leader of the Labour Party said that they wanted to nationalize the utility industry and the energy industry and make sure that it would be environmentally clean. And they were going to develop alternative fuels, using the wind, using the water around the UK, that was the way to go, and also get jobs for people. It seems like that might be a way to actually help the climate, but when you have companies that basically make money by selling more electricity, by selling more fossil fuel or power, I mean, that you're kind of in a no-win situation.
Yeah, there's definitely a situation where large corporations have the upper hand, even in the local communities. A big movement that's going on in the Bay Area right now, a local issue, was to get community choice aggregate power, to get away from the large corporations of PG&E being your only choice. I mean, choice is good. That's what drives business. That's what drives decision making. So we have a local community like Marin Clean Energy coming in and trying to offer people an alternative choice, but once again the utilities, the CPUC steps in and they're trying to squash that and saying we need a 1-year assessment, we need more time to do that. So these businesses are trying to have choice, are trying to offer us options, and we keep getting squashed down by this large corporate 1%.
And you have the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, where some workers there who were in charge of documents were retaliated against. They saw their documents being destroyed by that agency management. They were told to get rid of them. Do you have a concern that for employees at agencies which are supposed to be regulating the health and safety of the public, that they are under threat and face intimidation if they don't go along with the agenda?
Wow, well, that's pretty extreme. I think the employees on the ground where we kept our files and we have a separate Superfund record center, it would be hard to imagine a day that could occur, but I also have to say where we at now is a day that I thought would also be hard to imagine.
So there is the possibility.
I would hope not, but I suppose a lot of things keep changing.
So you're not optimistic right now about the future of the EPA being able to do its job?
I'm personally not, because I personally wasn't able to do my job.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us on WorkWeek Radio.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.